Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. Have you ever been confronted by someone who claims that patriarchy is a thing of the past and that women are no longer oppressed? I have heard this claim many times from old men and young men, even from women in conservative circles and very liberal ones. When these conversations happen, I have sometimes wished that I had a book that I could recommend that shared a real life example of blatant patriarchy alive and well in the 21st century. And especially, I've wished that I had known of a book that not only told someone's irrefutable life experience, but also showed how patriarchy was not a one off bad experience, but a manifestation of a massive system that affects all of us. Well, listeners, I found the book. It's called A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy. It's by Tia Levings, and I am so excited to welcome Tia to the podcast today. Welcome, Tia. Tia Levings is a writer, creator, and content specialist. She shines light on the abuses of Christian fundamentalism to educate, validate, and empower those who feel smashed by the patriarchy to create something beautiful from pain. And because when she went through the hell of church-sanctioned violence, she felt alone, but wasn't. There are thousands of others out there. Her memoir, A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy, came out in August 2024. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. Listeners, go out and buy this book. Check it out from your library. This is a must read from Breaking Down Patriarchy's library. So Tia Levings, again, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to talk about this with you.
Thank you for having me. This is like a long needed connection. So I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Me too. Well, I'd love to start out with a bit of a personal introduction. If you could tell listeners where you're from, just your basic info, where you grew up, your family of origin, and then kind of setting the stage for the topic that you write about in the book.
Yeah, and this is good because if you've read the book or are going to read the book, there's a little bit of overlap here, and I will explain why that was important in memoir craft to do. I started my first 10 years in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, lived on a farm, was a little wild child, feral kid of the 80s. And when I was 10, my parents decided to move to Jacksonville, Florida, which was total and utter culture shock, which I think became really important to my formation. We joined a mega church, which was a new kind of thing in the mid 80s. They're just very large churches that want to be as big as they can possibly be. And in the next 10 years, it would continue to grow to we eventually had 20,000 people on our membership roll. It was very large, 11 city blocks in Jacksonville, Florida. And it was my world. I went there 6 out of 7 days a week. Everyone I knew at my public high school also went to my church. So it was like I became very accustomed to living in a world within a world within a world, in plain sight without any walls. We didn't have to go to like a jungle to be in a cult. We could just, have our group think and never associate outside of our group. This is a theme that just repeats over and over in my childhood until we get to today. And I think it's really important for where we are today, because evangelical Christians, this was a Southern Baptist megachurch that our pastor was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So it was very mainstream, ordinary. It just looked like a good way to grow up for parents who were conscientious with their children. And they didn't really understand, because ideologies are not forthcoming with their goals, that we were becoming more fundamentalist and Christian nationalist as we went. We just thought we were being really patriotic and very devout. And there was groups in our church that were more devout than others. But that was okay because we were tolerant of that. And we weren't privy to their agenda to take over mainstream evangelical culture. And so there's this undercurrent of this wider world that's playing the whole time I'm growing up. And I think they're really critical 50 years because they're the 50 years that parallel the Christian nationalist agenda that we are living the manifestation of today. We all live under Christian fundamentalism today because the Heritage Foundation and these used to be fringe right-wing extreme groups are now in the top levels of government in deciding our laws. So huge pulses in our influences rather in our culture and governing and future and all of it. So there in between, I had 5 kids. I used to homeschool. I was a trad wife in the 90s. We didn't call it that. We called it traditional wife and mother. And today I create content that translates those evangelical influences in our headlines and culture today. So more of a cultural translator for people who know we're being impacted by something religious, but they don't fully understand why or how. And in that way, our work is very similar because we're
Mhm.
doing a lot of the same things to different audiences.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And such, I feel like we're cousins a little bit because
Yeah,
as you know, where I come from the Mormon tradition, and so a lot of your experience feels familiar to me. But there's like different vocabulary, different things are emphasized
right,
than what I'm familiar with. But I so appreciate that title of a cultural translator. And I do have to say too, like I'm sure you have these conversations all the time, like people, especially when we were living in the Bay Area in California, who are just like going through the 2016 and 2020, especially 2016, right, when it took everybody by surprise, was just shocking. Just going like, where did these people come from? I thought we resolved all this stuff 100 years ago. And I'm like, hello, oh my gosh, like they live in a different world within a world within a world, right? With no exposure to the way a lot of people in America live. And I do have to say, your book especially highlighted that, Tia. Like, it's not just some niche, tiny little kind of offshoot of
right,
Christianity, which I think is some people's impression. It is huge. And now people are finally starting to see it, but we need cultural translators
right.
to point out what's happening.
During the first Trump administration, I really felt that rising hard was people wanted to box it away like some sort of fringe on the side extreme group, Ruby Ridge, that kind of a thing. And I was like, absolutely not. We have been trained for decades to blend in with you so that we can take over. These are overt sermons that happen every Sunday. This is like Generation Joshua. I was in Shiny Happy People, so like that
Yeah.
shares some of the like actual plan and strategy to blend in. And mainstream America didn't realize when Lifeway Christian Bookstores is there, and you've got these movements like True Love Waits, and you have these like adjacent sort of para organizations that are bringing people into this end. And
Yeah.
so yeah, everything I used to call my life the real life prequel to The Handmaid's Tale, but literally everything I lived is here in our mainstream culture now. So,
Yeah.
it's chilling to be living the arc, but also predictable.
Yeah. Yeah, predictable for you, and I think that's why this is so important. So
Mm,
let's get into that arc. You gave us a really great introduction with kind of a high level,
mhm.
kind of bird's eye view of the phenomena, but this was personal for you. And as you point out, like you didn't, and this was really important for me too, to kind of try to understand your parents and
Yeah.
what they were perceiving was happening to their family. So if you could kind of walk us through that, what that felt like for your parents, what doctrines were you getting in church? And then what was just kind of the community? What was the gender messaging in your own family? Like, where were you starting to absorb these ideologies?
It is such a patchwork quilt, and I think it's important to the woman that I am today. And I think listeners of a Gen X generation or upper millennial will totally understand it from the inside out. Younger listeners maybe gain some compassion for the amount of information that they have available that simply wasn't in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's important context, the psychological growth and development of the field, the language that parents had available, the resources, the amount of information really has changed parenting and has changed culture. And so if we're looking at my parents as young 20 somethings in the early mid 70s, I was born in 74, and they're in the Midwest, and they are, my parents are like that. I don't know, sort of a Karen Carpenter song of like two young kids starting out and they're against the world, but they're together and they're going to do these things. And I come from a family of makers and craftspeople and very hardworking people who everyone pitches in. And there's not really a lot of gender division as far as work goes or role goes. It's just what if something needs to be done, someone does it.
Hmm.
Um, that said, I think my mom in particular wanted a certain status to develop in our family. Like they were tired of financially scrapping. They wanted that life of ease that was being so promoted in the 80s. They wanted to, attain financial stability. And so we're always working on that. in the undercurrent of my personal family culture. We have a lot of scarcity mindset that they're trying to overcome. And so all of that fed the decision to join this church. Like in Jacksonville, we had many, many opportunities. There's so many churches here. We could have picked something smaller, something more familiar. We gave a couple of those a shot. But the message in town very much was, if you wanted to be anybody, and if you especially wanted to keep your kids safe from adolescence and all the things that could go wrong, then you come down here. And again, to remember where my parents were, they're mid-20s. They have two little girls. They've just been financially devastated by losing their farm. We're 1,500 miles away from all of our family. And there's this massive marketing engine on the other side reaching out to parents in Jacksonville to bring their youth to Jacksonville. The whole emphasis was on building this monstrous youth group. And we had a middle school department. We called it junior high back then. It was 1,000 kids, and the high school was 1,000 kids. And it was just the whole focus of the church was the youth were the hope for the future, and that if you wanted to keep your kids safe, this is what you would do. And so I think my parents publicly and spiritually were like, put a lot of faith and trust in that. Um, but they were also really busy. And so like Gen X kids didn't have a lot of supervision. It was more like, this is your job. Go to church 6 days a week. We have our job. And we've done our best to put you in a safe place, and we will just trust it's going to work out. And, the youth pastors are at that time still doing some horrible things. I'm hearing some horrible messages, some awful things. They're in the book. And I wasn't necessarily telling my parents that part, because at 13, 14 years old, you're old enough to figure out what's going to upset the people around you and what they want to hear. And I was starting to mold myself for my own reasons into a good girl who would obey every rule, who would get approval, feel safety and love, and fit in. And so I have my own crisis happening, but it's not really involving my parents, because 80s parenting didn't really mix the generational lines that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, you figure it out.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so yes, I love the image of the patchwork quilt, that you're getting, input from lots of different people, lots of different experiences. If you're willing to talk about it, Tia, I know that from the book that one of the formative experiences that you had that kind of affected the way you saw the world in a lot of different ways was an experience with sexual violence. Are you willing to talk about that
Sure.
as kind of an influence on the way your psyche formed and you
Yeah.
became
And I will say, as far as sensitive issues go, if it's in the book, I've worked through it so well, we can talk about it. Like,
good? Okay,
yeah, part of the way I approached my memoir craft was that I would not re-traumatize myself retelling any of these stories. And so they are very well metabolized so that we
good.
can talk about them, because I feel the ability to talk about it is very important to collective freedom. Um, so that assault is interesting to me because I wrote it in the book without realizing the severity of it in my life. It was a pivotal moment for me. I was 13 years old, but it wasn't until an editor read it and pointed to that as my first assault that I even called it that. Um, and that was, I had been divorced and was 45 years old, at the time, at that point in the writing process. But the scene in the book is that I had a very hard time making friends. And so I made a friend with somebody who was of the more rebellious, independent nature. And we got into some sexual experimentation with boys, and one of those boys assaulted me. And it scared me so badly that I quickly repented and fit into the mold with all of the knee-jerk reaction, solo decision making of a 13-year-old who doesn't know what to do, and has no language for what happened. I'm just deeply ashamed. I felt like a lot of the warnings that I'd been told would happen had happened, and it was attributed to my sin, and that I needed to repent. And so I internalized this, I suppressed it, and it really only came out in the manuscript, because when you start putting scenes together for a book, you have to trace your decisions backwards. Why did I make this decision? How did I end up here? How did I end up here? And I kept unraveling backwards. And that's why, for example, my early childhood is mentioned in the book, because it turned out to be really important to how I broke free later. And I didn't know that until I went through the healing journey of writing. So that's why I always tell people, write your stories, because the discoveries will surprise you. Yeah, so that assault happened, and it really was a pivotal, inciting event in my journey to being the best little good girl I could be.
Yeah. Because as you said, the lessons that you were taught at church was that obedience would keep you safe from some of those very things, right? So that
Yeah.
made you retreat into the structure even
It's
more.
never the boy's fault. It's never the
Yeah.
system's fault. If you wanna stay safe, you just need to obey better.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that leads us to kind of your later teenage years and your courtship experiences. Can you talk about that? Kind of like in general,
Yeah.
the kind of the theory and practice of courtship in general, but then what that was like for you with your then became husband.
Yeah, the whole concept of courtship as we understand it today was just on the cusp of the fundamentalist families in our church, and I'm just a little bit old enough to have dodged the worst of it, and again, had the kind of parents who would not have, done the model the way that it's prescribed just a few years later in, books like Josh Harris's I Kissed Dating Goodbye, for example, that really laid out father courtship selection. So it was in the conversation around us. But the gist of courtship is that you are to remain a virgin and pure in your before marriage, and your father, your parents, because they know you better than you know yourself, will select a partner for you, and they will guide you through this courtship and engagement process, and then you will be passed from your father to your new husband. Um, my version of that as somebody who was getting kind of a diluted influence of it, was that my friends were in deeper, so I was getting their influence of what they wanted with their fathers. But also in my mind, I had clocked that the way you knew God's best for your life was that he would tell you, "I'm God's best for you, and I wanna marry you." We didn't talk about chemistry or compatibility or what you need to really look for in a spouse. It was when we talked about that, like what you should look like in a future mate. It was always like godly behavior and will he pray with your family, and it has really nothing to do with two people really becoming good partners and life mates, like we could talk about in psychology, which blows my mind because I think they just assumed young people are horny and they like each other, and so we need to get them married quickly before we have a bunch of unmarried babies, children born out of wedlock. And so my whole goal was to just be a virgin on my wedding day, and I had to fight hard to do that because he wanted to have sex before we were married, but I made it. Not assault free and not violation free, but the actual deed was successful. And then I was raped 3 times on my wedding night. So it was not the reward they promised. And it didn't have the outcome that I had spent the last 10 years, hearing would be so beautiful and sacred and holy. And then I was married and stuck. And that really changes everything for a Christian girl.
Hmm. How were you experiencing it at the time? Because as you tell the story, I thought you did such an amazing job really getting into your head
Mhm.
when you were experiencing it so that we could feel that like empathy and almost like see things through your eyes while also still having that
Yeah.
later narrator with the wisdom. But we really could feel things as you felt them.
I'm
Could
so
you
glad.
like get us into that a little?
Yeah, I'm so glad. That's a writing reflection and a skill that writers can hone. I really wanted this to feel like the reader was with me in the moment and that I wasn't telling it from a higher evolved version of myself, which was controversial from writing standpoint because a lot of memoir has that older, wiser voice that steps in and says, and my editor did ask for a little of that here and there. But the early drafts and for the majority of the book is that I wanted you to feel like I was in the scene. You were in the scene with me and understand why I made the choices that I made. That part was important. I wanted you to not have more information than I had and feel those emotions that I felt. And so I had to get really in my head in order to just write it and not self-edit and not give myself more skill or discernment or, experience. Like I'm a mom who's raised teenagers at this point. And so
Yeah.
it was very tempting to write my 19-year-old scenes from a mom's point of view and warn people,
Yeah. Yeah.
But my 19-year-old self did not have that. And so I had to really get in my head and just dissociate as she dissociated and go where she went and tell people what it was like because everything I did in those scenes informed what happened the next morning or the next year, that is how it happened for me. And I think that has worked. That's the feedback is that people feel like they were in that journey with me and they
Oh, yeah.
understand now why somebody would stay in violence why they would feel like they can't get out, and how it malforms your faith and the whole experience of being a Christian wife and mother when you're being abused and your church is saying that this is God's design for your life.
Yeah. Yeah, you really did nail it because that's
Yeah.
exactly my experience as a reader. And yeah, so if you can tell us a little bit, just kind of describe what it did feel like to you in your marriage with those conflicting feelings. How aware were you that what was happening to you was sexual assault, that it was rape? I think you weren't aware of that at the
I wasn't.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I had no language for that, and I wouldn't
Yeah.
have called it that because my mindset at the time was to, like, say somebody raped you is mean, you're being mean to them,
Yeah.
and, he's a nice guy, and he's trying so hard, and, my husband was earnest and passionate for God and wanted to, like, very sorry, when he caused pain, and, I didn't have any perspective to realize that was a cycle and that there was mental illness at play, and his own issues and the impact of patriarchal teaching on men, it toxifies them too. That's all language that we have in 2025. We didn't have it in 1995. And so I did know that marriage could be hard. We talked a lot about that openly. We talked about how suffering aligned you with Christ. And so I knew that it hurt and that I wasn't happy, and I thought, well, that's my life. That's the cards that I drew. That's the bed that I made. I'm here and this is what I have now. And because I had babies so quickly, you really are there now. Divorce is not an option. Death is better than to getting a divorce. And so I just had to, again, like, I'm kind of following what my parents did when they just made the best of a bad situation. That's really what I thought I was doing. It was like, okay, well, these are my lumps. What can I make with it? And that resourcefulness is two sides, like, there's good side to that for survival, but there's also, an accommodating that happens and an accepting of what's unacceptable, and a very unhappy life. Like, I didn't expect to be happy because nothing in Christianity was saying I was allowed to be happy on the earth. All my happiness would come in eternity. I just needed to hang in there through my earthly years and, store my treasures up.
Yeah. And it seems like, I mean, the solutions when things weren't going well, it was always blamed on your lack of obedience or your lack of
Mhm.
submission, right? Like,
Yeah.
so that was just kind of, it seemed like a vicious cycle too of just, and it can lead you further and further and further into more fundamentalist
And it's so
ways of,
plausible. I'm imperfect. I was emotional. I was not handling things well. I was sometimes, I have ADHD and, I'm a little neurospicy that way, but we didn't have, again, language for that. And so when I was distractible or I would forget something, it was very easy for me to say, okay, I just need to keep getting better at this Christian wife stuff. And there's lots of books to help me. And that's, lots of mentors. All the messaging is if you're just a more pleasing wife, you can bless your husband, and if you bless your husband, then he won't hurt you. He'll feel more stable. So that's, I'm immersed in all of that, and it makes sense to me.
and let's talk a little bit more too about the toxicity of patriarchy in men's lives. And
Mhm.
specifically, I saw this so much with your husband, your ex-husband now, but that patriarchy and that way of thinking of pushing it off to everybody else just really stunts them
Yeah.
emotionally because they never have to confront their own demons. They don't have to do any internal work. They can always blame it on the woman in their life,
Mhm.
and they don't have to learn how to regulate their own, their own nervous systems or confront any of their own weaknesses, and so they become really stunted and then also sometimes really violent. So can you tell us kind of where was your husband getting his ideas about gender roles and sex and what he could expect from women, and like also his ideas about eroticism, because it seemed like there were some times that he was being influenced by factors that you didn't really know he was being influenced by.
Oh, sure. And I almost, like, wanna give listeners a hug and say these moments are usually epiphanies and connections. So, I just wanna hug you if you're having one because, it was right in front of me all the time. So, and this is very relevant right now because John MacArthur has just died, and John MacArthur was a major primary voice of, gender division, complementarianism, patriarchy, submission, staying in abuse. He, validated slavery. He He validated oppression. He swept abuse under the rug, and he was the big voice of Southern Baptist and evangelical denominations. And so that's a lot of that's coming up in the current day conversation because he died this week. John Piper, again, believes that women should stay in abuse, has spoken publicly on that before. And so my husband, who is very devout and very, studious, was reading these men, and they all lead to other men the same way I was reading Bible study books and they were leading to other ladies. And so we go down this chain, and I do have it mapped out in the book where we are changing churches because he's searching for the right church and the right answer. And every step is another step towards true faith and true Christianity. And the movement's becoming more reformed at that time, again, through MacArthur's influence largely. And so becoming more reformed after you've been Southern Baptist feels like going to college, because you're no longer just like evangelizing to people to get them saved. Now you're diving deep into the Word of God, and you are getting into these deeper tenets of what it really means to live a Christian life.
One other question on this particular issue too was the role of pornography, and I thought this phrase that you used of misplaced eroticism was so interesting to me, because this is something that I'm still grappling with in like incel ideology, of how a man can, like, on one hand, I think, feel genuine, like, you could call it love, some sort of distorted form of love, but like desire for a woman's companionship. And, if you think of him as like there's a child in there who really wants to be loved and wants to be accepted, right? But it
Right.
gets warped. And then especially how that can turn into something really violent in pornography. And it seemed like that was something that the church either, I don't know about encouraged men to watch pornography, but maybe kind of like turned a blind eye. Can you talk about that relationship of how that misplaced eroticism took shape?
I'm glad we're talking about this. Nobody brings this up in interviews, and I think it needs more time talking. I think they actually create the drive for porn.
Mm.
And I know that that's like, oh my goodness, you wouldn't like, excuse me, hold on. You wouldn't think that churches who are fighting porn would also be causing porn, but the root is objectification of women. And modesty culture begins in infancy. And we aren't telling men not to look at babies. We are covering our babies. So I think from what my experience is with it is that the church was systematically objectifying women and putting them into boxes and roles that they had to serve, and reducing them to body parts that were of use to the patriarchy. And porn takes that and amplifies it. And then when they find out that they're using their eyes to look at porn, then now they have this whole other cycle, this whole other industry of fighting porn, and it becomes this big distraction. What I find is that men who are psychologically healthy and don't objectify women don't have porn problems. So, or violence problems or misogyny problems. So I do think that it's another situation where they create the problem and then they try to offer the solution for the problem they created.
Wow. That is so, it is just kind of staring us in the face, but I don't think I've heard anyone articulate it so clearly. And you bring up in the book even like Josh, was it Josh Duggar's?
Yeah.
One of the, yeah, could you just mention that really
Right.
quickly? Because I thought that was
So
interesting.
Josh Duggar is the oldest Duggar child, and he was aggressively disciplined from infancy. When the time the Duggars got their TV show, 19 Kids and Counting, he had already been sent to a behavior camp for molesting his four sisters, or sisters and two friends, I believe it is. And they kept that all on the down low and hid it. And then through the course of the show, like it's about 10 years pass, he gets married, he has family, he's in numerous scandals, Ashley Madison cheating scandal, and is eventually arrested for child torture porn, where he is serving prison now. And it is relevant to my story because that's the IBLP, that's the Institute of Basic Life Principles, Bill Gothard's institution that my mentors were grooming me into, even though I never attended a conference. And when I saw the Duggars on TV, I recognized our cult on TV and thought, oh, how are they going to do this with cameras in the house? And then I was in Shiny Happy People that exposed that. But my work became public when I heard people saying Josh Duggar was a bad apple. He was a single bad apple, and that this was just an exception in this otherwise lovely family. And I was like, oh, hella no. He's a product of the system, and there are more of them than you could fathom. And if we don't start talking about it, this is going to slide right under the radar. I'm a big believer in a lot of things slip by when people insist they're not possible. It's our cognitive dissonance that we have to check ourselves. If we're thinking something's not possible, we better hella pay attention to the evidence. Are people already saying it has happened? For example, Epstein's list is in the news right now. We have all the survivor accounts. We already know who's on that list because we have survivors saying who's on that list. And yet there's all this outcry for this. We have to know about the men, the men, the men. No, if you actually look at what's happened, you already have the information, but we don't want to, that's we don't want to see it. And I know so many people loved or enjoyed watching the car accident on the Duggar family. They thought they were weird, but they couldn't look away. And the temptation with the trad wife movement, is to look at this and think it's sweet and innocent, and it's anything but. And the only people who can say are the people who've lived it and come out of it, and there's just not very many of us that have, done the work to not re-traumatize ourselves and also be able to clarify exactly what does this mean? What does this mean to the average American? It means a lot right now, but that's why we have
Yeah.
to talk about it.
Yes. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for doing that. And like you said, it's not a one-off. It
Mm,
is a product of the system. So let's switch gears just a little bit. It's kind of actually a continuation of the story. You were often really isolated, and as you talked about a minute ago, kind of your husband, as he was trying to find the quote unquote right church, really kind of tried to isolate you on purpose and move you even farther and farther out from society. But you developed close friendships with two kind of, I would say, two different groups of women, right?
mhm.
One was the church women, and you developed kind of some role models and some older mothers that you were kind of, learning from, I guess, as we all do, because we all need community, especially as we're raising our little kids. And
Yeah.
then there was an online community. So, can you talk about those two groups of women and how each one of them influenced you?
Yeah, the first group, I call them in my content, my Gothard Fundy mentors, because they were of Bill Gothard's group. And we knew them as the special Christians or the super devout Christians in our church congregation because they dressed like Little House on the Prairie. They didn't use birth control, and we knew that because they had enormous families. And they were just kind of like respected because they were willing to be a little holier than everyone else. And so when I was a young mom and I was very afraid of my baby crying through the night and setting my husband off even more, I turned to them for advice, which was very biblical. Titus 2 is let the older women teach the younger to love their husbands. And so I thought I was being extra obedient, to like humble myself and say, please teach me. Even though I knew a lot about infant care at that point, I had been a daycare worker and a nanny for several years. And um, I didn't have any problems taking care of my newborn. But I had a lot of problems in understanding how I was going to control the uncontrollability of infant care and noise and just the things that happen when you're taking care of a small person. And so I asked for that advice, and they, unbeknownst to me, they were looking for little acolytes that they could bring into their fundamentalist group. And so we became their students. My husband and I, he was with the men and I was with the women, and this is about 6 to 8 women in the nursing room. It seemed very innocent and warm and the kind of thing that a young mom would be very grateful for. And it wasn't until years passed and I realized the things that they're teaching me are oppressive and unhappy and contributing to the abuse in my family. They're asking me to do things I wasn't comfortable with doing. For example, blanket train and switch my babies, which is the practice of switching babies to make them stay on a blanket.
Like switching as in hitting,
Hitting.
right? Like,
We're
yeah,
using
yeah,
a
a
rod.
switch.
We
Yeah.
use glue sticks, and I wouldn't do it. And I didn't want to after there's a major story in the book where my third baby has a heart defect and dies. And when I had gone through that experience and the hospital and the time away and everything, I couldn't go back to my mentors in the same way because I knew the kinds of things they were going to tell me I wasn't willing to do anymore. I was a changed person. and I didn't understand how or why. I just knew I couldn't go backwards. And, but I still had this need for community and friendship. And so it was conveniently the same year that the internet really took off. And I went to the internet and I looked for other homeschooling moms, and I found this group of other kinds of Christians. These were more secular Christians. These were self-educators. These were like the homeschooling movement was starting to gain traction, but that didn't mean it was only Gothard homeschoolers. It was also people who wanted their kids to go to college really young, or people who valued classical education, which was just beginning to rise because Susan Wise Bauer's book, which is closely titled to mine, but totally unintentionally, her book is A Well-Trained Mind. Um, that was going, like wildfire through the homeschooling world. And so these forums popped up, and I got to participate in them and bond with people that I'm still friends with today. Um, and we formed this society called the Trapdoor Society. My friend Julie named it that for a theater reference. And we self-educated, and just it's one of the most fun plot twists of my life. It's still there. It's still my beating heart to learn and to study and broaden. And I never got to go to college, and so I feel like I'm living a college education in real time. And Trapdoor is a big piece of that.
Yeah, that was so amazing. As those two parallel parts of your life were kind of developing, I felt like, yeah, there were the two of the different parts of Tia, right? And this intellectual, which you clearly are innately, was given
Hmm.
room to run, right? Like you start like to be writing and to be exploring ideas
Yeah.
um, with these, yeah, very curious minds, other like-minded women.
But still really safe, They were still
Yes.
of a Christian worldview.
Yeah.
They were still home educating their children, so we were all living a very alternative lifestyle at a time where it was still very unusual to do that. And we were reading things like Jane Eyre, so it wasn't like in your face
Yeah.
feminism,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
You're not reading the feminine mystique or something. It's
not
all
yet.
very, yeah. 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 Okay. But in the meantime, also you're developing your skills as a writer by blogging
Yes.
about your trad wife lifestyle, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so, my brother-in-law, bless his heart, gave me a domain and my first website as a Christmas present one year. He's a web developer, and it, again, changed my life. I had always been a writer, but had not had an outlet to share it publicly. And so I became what would the equivalent of a trad wife influencer at the time, because I was blogging about our traditional lifestyle and homesteading and homeschooling. And it was called Living Deliberately. And I had a knack for it, and I had a knack for search engine optimization, which again, vocabulary that was evolving. And so it took off. I had 80,000 hits a week, sometimes a day. I mean, it was a
Wow.
very popular blog for a while.
Yeah.
In a whole network of popular blogs.
Yeah.
Little era of the internet that was sweet.
Yeah. And amazing. And it really was allowing you to develop. And I do have to say, Tia, too, on a personal level, just how much I related to this. I look back on some of my early blogging too, and I can see like, oh, she's such a good writer and she wants to be like engaging with interesting ideas. But like such a huge percentage of it was like faith affirming stories
Right.
and like just such religious language when I was a young mom also. And I can see this persona that I was projecting into the world of like this devout woman, but I also was like trying to develop myself as
Yeah.
an intellectual. And not to say that those two things are not compatible, because they are, in some people are able to like flourish in all of the ways. But for me, because I know that I was like struggling with a faith crisis
Mhm.
personally, it's just, it kind of like breaks my heart a little bit to watch that in my writing. You can see the tension that I'm
Yes,
starting to
the
feel, and I
masculine.
felt that in your book so much too.
Yeah.
And you wrote that you eventually kind of realized that balancing these two worlds wasn't possible, that became impossible for you to have like this, your fundamentalist Christian life, and then also the ideas and the pull toward independence, that wasn't possible. Can you talk about that kind of tipping point? What happened
Yes,
next in your
and so
life?
I've learned so much more about this even since writing the book, because it was a big part of the second book that's coming out next May. Um, so indoctrination interferes with child development, and the indoctrination that I was under taught us to split ourselves. So we had our lost self, and then we had a saved self. We had a good self and a bad self. And they talk about this all the time. You have your sin nature and then your higher nature. And, and you want to feed the good wolf and not starve the bad wolf. It's like you learn to bifurcate from a very young age and put the best presentation of yourself forward to be safe and accepted and have belonging and love. And you're going to use the right lingo. You're going to behave the same way. You're going to fall into the uniformity. So much of this experience is learning to dress right, talk right, modulate your voice, perform what it means to be a good Christian girl. And if that's not the truth of where you are all of the time, which it's not, I think, in anybody I know, you have a war inside of yourself. And that war is a temporary condition. You can't sustain it or you'll break. And I think that's what happened. These two groups that this line I was trying to walk, they're mutually exclusive. I couldn't continue to grow as Tia and be in this world, and I couldn't sustain the world, um, let alone bring real Tia, let her grow there. So I was at a, life or death moment for me before we even get to the hostage situation, because I was ready to quit. I was breaking under the weight of that. I could not live in some realms and die in others. And I knew I was going to have to kill part of myself off. And I couldn't. It's like a death of the psyche that you just can't sustain. Your form can't, and your mind can't. And so that's the definition of a nervous breakdown, right? I mean, I was right on the cusp of it, and I couldn't take it. And parallel to that, I was getting excommunicated for my writing about Mary, of all things, and not putting my name in my writing in my husband's name. And my husband's mental illness was ramping up, and he was having his own psychotic break. So the instability kind of all comes to this giant head in this. That's what makes the memoir feel like a novel, in that there's this climax that not everybody gets in their life point, I think, but mine definitely did come together that way. Yeah. Mm. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, so, when I left, it was catastrophic and complete. There was absolutely no going back. We all knew it. Um, that's a sudden severance of your life. You don't get to have an extended divorce or something, like where you're kind of thinking about it and weighing and getting counsel. And none of that was true for me. It was immediate shock into a new environment. In a lot of ways, paralleled the experience I'd had as a child, with an immediate shock in a new environment. And my nervous system, which I didn't know that language, but my nervous system was definitely feeling that, parallel. Um, I had 4 kids who'd also been through all of that trauma. They were 11 and younger. My baby was 2 when we left. My oldest was 10. And yeah, I had to. I mean, it's a both and. I had to put my life back together, build a sense of self, um, heal. At the same time, all of the tools and resources for that were being popularized and developed. So, like, religious trauma wasn't a language that was available in 2007, but just about 18 months to 2 years later would be. Inner child work, trauma therapy, complex PTSD, EMDR, some of the modalities that I've done, parts work, internal family systems, all of these things have come into being, through my recovery. And all I did at the beginning was decide, you've had a second chance. You're going to take it by the horns. You're going to commit to yourself, and this is not going to be your whole life. I could not fathom the idea that 13 years got to be my whole story, and that would be all I did with my life. I was only 33 years old, and I wanted my life back. And so I knew I wasn't going to get my children's babyhood or my 20s or anything like that back, but I knew there was more ahead than all that had been. I knew that I had a lot ahead of me if I could learn how to do it, you know. I did fall into a second high control marriage, but it wasn't abusive in the same way. It looked very benevolent, and so I got to learn about benevolent patriarchy firsthand. Which has also been useful to me in my work. And that husband asked to be dismissed when I sold my book. He did not want to be married to a writer. He liked me better when I was subservient and quiet and sweet and devout. And I wasn't by the end of my healing journey. I was independent and self-developed and actualized. And patriarchs don't really know how to cooperate, the co part of cooperate with that kind of independence. So a lot of life change has started to happen from 2022 when I sold the book and also got divorced to today. And the second book, which I can't tell you the title of because we haven't revealed it yet, but it's coming out next May, and it's a self-help book navigating the journey of survival and finding hope again after religious trauma. Which it's not memoir; it's self-help on how I navigated that so that other people can, because it's a huge, like, it's overwhelming to come out into the world and be unsure of who to trust and unsure of what to try and what works and doesn't, and everything's expensive. And there's some tragedies in my healing story. I didn't get to be a healed mom while my kids were growing up. I wish that I could go back just even 8 years and know the words emotional regulation. That would have been helpful. If I'd had medication for panic attacks, would have been really helpful. Things that, it's hard to raise 4 children in a high control marriage, second marriage. And that's a grief, but grief work has also been really important to healing. And admitting complicity and carrying it and giving back and turning around to help other survivors is all part of the healing process. So it's ongoing. I don't think deconstruction or trauma healing are things that are ever finished. I think it'll be true of me for the rest of my life. And that's why I have made it my endeavor. It is my day job. It is my calling. It is the focus of my whole work, because even though the tragedy that I lived through is not going to be my whole life, probably the material that they gave me is a lifetime of material.
Yeah, that's a good
It's
way of
certainly
looking at
relevant.
I love that glass half full way to frame that. It's great.
Yeah.
I do have to say too, something that was just palpable the whole time I read the book was how much you love your children, like your fierce love and protection of your children, and how much you actually did trust your instincts. And I have to say too, going back to the blanket training, I didn't have any exposure to that, but the sleep training, and when the book mentioned Gary Ezzo, I was like, oh, is
Yeah.
that the Baby Wise guy? Because everybody was reading on becoming baby wise when I was having my first child, and I tried it and sobbed, bawled my eyes out on the couch with pillows over my head while I let my baby scream. And by the time I had my second child, I couldn't do it. But I bring that up just as for two reasons, and now this is a tangent, but how these ideologies really do make their way into mainstream American culture. Like, I had no idea that Gary Ezzo was associated with.
It's such an important portal, because he had a secular version of his book that he sold in Barnes and Noble, and he had the Christian version that we studied on Sunday nights. And so
Oh,
here you have the perfect example of material that was rising in churches that were becoming more authoritarian and patriarchal. Gary Ezzo is assigning, manipulation to newborns and this horrible sin nature to newborns. He's an easy entry point to Michael Pearl, who's talking about sin nature of newborns. And so James Dobson's most extreme stuff too. And so you have that whole end of it. But then he thought he had a market in the mainstream for sleep training. And so they would come out with these series of books, Baby Wise and Child Wise. I think
yes.
they even have a Teen Wise, and they have all the spiritual references stripped out of them. and it is presented as this scientific, psychologically, vetted resource for parents, and it's none of those things. Like,
Yeah.
it's bogus and it's bunk, and babies have died from it, and eventually he lost his publisher, and he lost, all of that footing, that and that respect that he'd had, but the trail had been done. Like, there's
Yeah.
broken mothers and broken newborns. I did the same thing, the stories in the book, but it was um, terrible heartbreak. And my son doesn't hold it against me, but now knowing what I know about attachment parenting and attachment wounds, um, sometimes knowledge increases the grief. Like, I knew that was happening, but I didn't have vocabulary for it at the time. It was breaking my heart nonetheless. And now I know why. Now I have language and power to combat it. But, thankfully my grandchildren aren't being raised that way.
Yeah.
That's been something to redeem.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I brought that up also just because I just felt that so much in the book, how much you actually, yeah, that you loved your children so fiercely, would do anything for them, and that you did trust your intuition a lot, actually, and protected them.
Mhm.
It could have been so much worse, but your mother, wisdom and intuition knew better. And then also there's, not to diminish the grief for sure, but there is something really powerful too, I think, about processing that with your kids
Mhm.
as they're older, because all of us, and including them, will make mistakes and do the best with the information we have at the moment. And to be able to say, like, we're all on this journey together. When
Right.
we know better, we do better. And that process of repair, I think, is actually a really beautiful model in families too.
I
So
take so much hope from it. Right now, we're seeing a resurgence of the same patriarchal parenting, the same
yes.
top-down trad things. The difference is, you just said it, the information we had at the time. We truly didn't have counter information in the 80s and 90s. We absolutely do now. We have more information to science, research, testimony, testimonials, memoirs, firsthand accounts than ever before in history. And so today's parents, when they're presented with information, I hope you say, are there survivors from this? What are the outcomes? Because there is a trail where you can find out how it worked for someone and listen to that wisdom, because that is exactly what we didn't have. And this is how we advance and learn from our mistakes.
Yeah.
And so that each generation truly does do better than the ones that came before it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm sad that the hour has passed already. This has been just such an enlightening and wonderful conversation. I'm just wondering if we can, as we wrap up, just have you share with listeners any action items that would be applicable, maybe for those who are listening who are currently religious
Mhm.
and those who are not. What would some action items be?
Yeah. So, number one is always listen to the discordant in your system. If you feel a defense mechanism rising to protect a viewpoint or an experience, if you feel a nudge that something's a little off, you don't have to know why right away. Just trust that you're feeling that. You do have computers now. So go ahead and tack survivor on the end of any suggestion someone gives you or outcome and find out what those other things are. Also, I think right now it's really important to read books, um, not just nonfiction books that inform you, but read for pleasure, read for joy, read broadly, read bravely. And the other one is be happy. Like, patriarchy and fundamentalism hates joy. They are killjoys, literally. They will ruin and regulate literally everything, from what you watch to what you do to what you wear. Everything has to be uniform and the same. Go ahead and break something, paint something, don't follow the color rules. Do something that's, out of your norm. Turn left instead of right when you go to the grocery store. Every time we break those kinds of rote patterns, we're challenging our mind to think more openly. And that makes us less easily controlled by high control forces that want to exploit us. So the action steps are kind of ordinary, but that is the resistance.
Hmm. Perfect. I love that. Okay, well, I am so excited for your new book coming out next year. I will anxiously await the big title reveal. In the
Yes.
meantime, Tia Levings, thank you so much. And actually, if you can tell us just really quickly where listeners can find your work on social media and everywhere else that you are doing your
Yeah.
work.
I'm at Tia Levings on all the social platforms. My Substack is is What the Fundamentalist. So tialevings.substack.com, and my website is tialevings.com. I have a fundy cheat sheet on there if you don't know some of the insider terms of the things that we talk about in this form of patriarchy. And A Well-Trained Wife is available everywhere books are sold.
And again, cannot recommend it highly enough. Go out and buy it today. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tia, for being here.
Thank you for this. So much fun.